All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, actually. Well, whatever time it is when you're watching this video. I'm really excited to be here virtually and to be presenting at GIS Day 2021 with Statistics Canada. I'm also even more excited to see and to continue to watch everyone's presentations throughout the day. It's been also GIS week at work, and it's been so exciting to meet so many people who are interested in GIS, who love GIS, and to hear them talk about why they love GIS and how they use it, and really learn more about the multidisciplinary nature of the method of GIS, which is what my presentation will be talking a little bit about. But before we get into that, I want to introduce myself. My name is Isaac Williams. I'm the GIS and Data Services Librarian over at Brock University. Before I worked over at Brock, I actually worked in a very similar role at the University of Texas at Arlington in the United States. I worked as the data visualization and GIS librarian there for a few years. I also received my Master of Library and Information Science degree in the States from the University of California, Los Angeles. I think that sometimes people don't necessarily associate librarians with data, or they don't necessarily associate data science with librarians. But I really love my job. And, put simply, my job involves me helping students and faculty work with data, including geospatial data. I work with a broad range of data with an additional focus on GIS. Broad topics that I help with include things like research data management, finding and accessing data, and learning how to use digital tools and programs. And another bit of it is that I've also worked with digital humanities and digital scholarship. In particular, I've worked on and I've created a lot of different mapping projects, which brings me to the topic of today's talk, which is on humanities GIS. So today I'll be talking a little bit about what humanities GIS is, what kinds of questions it poses, and how the idea of a humanities-informed GIS influenced a mapping project that I created. Let me go to the next slide. So I think that first off, it's useful to start off with a definition. What exactly is humanities GIS? To answer this, I think it also might be helpful to take a step back and also sort of describe or define what digital humanities are. So there are a lot of different definitions of digital humanities, and that multiplicity is really captured by the website whatisdigitalhumanities.com, which you'll see up on the screen. Whatisdigitalhumanities.com shows a randomly selected definition of the term whenever you refresh the page. And I think those definitions were taken between 2007 and 2015. So things have, undoubtedly changed since then. There are new methods, new tools that people can use, as well as broader conversations that are happening regarding what digital humanities are and how those function in relation to maybe the quote unquote analog humanities or just the regular humanities. And so, there are a lot of different tools and methods that are involved in the discipline. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it. So getting a concrete definition can sometimes be a little bit difficult without, getting too broad or too specific. The way that I really think about it, the way that I really conceptualize digital humanities is that, broadly speaking, digital humanities as a discipline includes any way that digital technology is used to explore, illustrate, or investigate humanities questions or conduct humanities research. So this can include a wide variety of tools, from tools and methods, really including things like TEI, text analysis, image analysis, and then of course now what I'll be talking about now, which is mapping and GIS. So I would extend this similar sort of definition to GIS then. As GIS is one method that DH, digital humanities practitioners can use to conduct research or to visualize data or scholarship. So humanities GIS follows in that same vein of using GIS to explore, illustrate, or investigate humanities questions. And getting into this, we get into sort of one of the maybe contentious points about digital humanities, which is this whole idea of quantification. And it can be kind of a sore spot because a lot of humanists don't really like to think about what they work with as data. I think sometimes people have a specific idea of what data is, and maybe in a humanities context, that definition can be a little bit different. I think, personally, I see data as being sort of similar to the word information. And I see, I think one good example of this is in the book Data Feminism by Lauren F. Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio. They describe data science as being, basically a method by which you systematically work with data to answer a question, or you use data to investigate a problem. So it's less so about working with a specific kind of data, say numeric data, and more about, are you using data, some form of data, to help you investigate something or create something? And that is more the idea of data science. So, I'm a humanist myself. I majored in English. I did not major in computer science. So I take a similar sort of broad view about what data is. And I think, though, that this brings up an interesting tension, which is that with digital humanities, with GIS, you're going to try to somehow translate humanities scholarship and humanistic knowledge into something that's machine readable and machine renderable. Basically, you have a problem of you're working with data, which is, humanities data. It can be very, I'm not quite sure what the best word is to describe it, but there's a lot of different kinds of humanities knowledge, right? You can consider an artwork, a piece of literature, an experience, historical documents, and even more kinds of like quote unquote documents or experiences can be used as humanities knowledge or humanities works. So the problem then that you run into is trying to translate that, that richness of experience, that sort of nuance, into something that you can put into a spreadsheet or turn into a file and then have that be readable by your visualization tool. So, it's an interesting tension. There's no one way around it. It's very context dependent, and it totally depends on your discipline, but it is something to be aware of. So looking at this, looking at these questions, I want to go into a project that I worked on that is sort of a digital humanities project. I'm not sure if I would directly call it that, but it is an example of humanities GIS, and that is the Queer Dallas StoryMap, or the Mapping Queer Dallas project, which you'll be able to get to if you go to the link on the screen, which is bit.ly/queer-dallas. And this mapping project is one that I worked on. I guess let's get into it, So the Queer Dallas Mapping Project is one that I worked on to sort of map the relatively recent history of queer people and trans people in Dallas, Texas. And I say relatively recent, not because queer people are new to Dallas, but because the historical periods I was looking at were relatively recent. I think the earliest periods that I looked at were probably the 50s or the 60s. So, things around that time period, and I didn't look at things that were very much earlier. But, the question that I get sometimes is why Dallas? And I think this brings up an interesting point as far as humanities scholarship with GIS works, which is that sort of collision, right, of the humanities and this sort of humanities knowledge and the GIS program itself. And that's because I chose Dallas for a combination, or maybe, an interweaving or of personal, political, and geographic reasons. All of these intertwine, they're all connected. I I chose Dallas because the American South, and Texas really in particular, um, has a reputation for being an unfriendly place to live if, like me, you're queer or you're trans. And, in some ways that is true. And there were things that I encountered in Dallas that would probably not have happened if I had stayed in my home state. Um, but it's also true that while that is happening, there's also a large community of queer people, like there is like there is in many southern cities, right? There is a large community of queer people who are advocating for change, who are fighting to make things more accepting and safer. Um, and so this project that I did was really one of, I wanted to understand not only the history of queer people in Dallas, but I also sort of wanted to locate myself in that history. I think to a degree, I wanted to better understand, where do I fit in with this as somebody who moved here recently and is living here and is experiencing problems here, but has also found so much joy in this place. So in some ways, while it was a way to make sense of the sort of external world and, mapping external things, it was also more, it was sort of also charting my own internal geography, which is sort of, like I said, another example of that kind of collision or conflict or tension between, in my opinion, the digital and the humanities, which I'll get into a little bit later. For the project, right, I chose to use StoryMaps. I find that StoryMaps can be a really useful tool when you're working with humanities data, because it allows for you to use a variety of media in your project. You can use images, sound, video, you can use a ton of things, which is really great. It's also web-based, it's embeddable, so it's relatively easy to, it's relatively easy to then share your project. You can embed it in your website, and people don't really need to have a special kind of computer to look at your map. They can even look at it on a phone, on a tablet. There's a lot of different options for consuming it and for engaging with it. With StoryMaps, right, there's also the opportunity for textual explication of your material. So what I did with my story map, which you'll be able to see if you have it open, is I really wrote down a lot of history about Dallas, and I wrote down some of my thoughts about scholarship on the history of not only Dallas, but about queer media, lesbian media. And this sort of textual explication allowed me to sort of break down what I saw as the meaning in the geography and break it down into something that made sense. There is also, it's free. So if you use StoryMaps to the degree that you're using the relatively basic features of StoryMaps, it is free to use. Although, if you want to create sort of an advanced project, if you're creating something with institutional funds, I would probably recommend shelling out for a professional account. But this map really started out as sort of a hobby project of mine. And I found the free version to be totally acceptable, totally useful. So there's that. I used a variety of media in sort of compiling this data, which is another way, right, that humanities GIS will differ from traditional sorts of GIS. With traditional, quote unquote, traditional forms of GIS, right, if you're working with, say, social science data, or you're working with earth sciences data, that data might already be sort of designed with the idea in mind that you will be using it for GIS. You would be compiling that data and sort of adding information to it that allows you to relatively easily use it with a GIS program. But the thing with humanities GIS, right, is that basically the sources that you're using they're not readily compiled as data sets. They don't always come with the same degree of detailed geographic information in them. And you'll probably be using a variety of sources to sort of come to a complete picture of your topic. So one moment, let me grab my cat off the table. Here we go. Everybody wants to know about GIS. So for example, for my project, I looked a lot at academic material. In particular, there is a scholar named Alexandra Ketchum who she's a scholar at McGill, and she researches a lot of queer and feminist history, especially as they apply to things like restaurants, community organizations, and media. I also looked at local archives. In Dallas, we had Dallas Way, which collects a lot of information about queer history in Dallas. I also looked at the University of North Texas's LGBTQ archive. A lot of their archival collections are digitized also, which made it helpful. And they also actually have, I believe they have a collection of material that was donated to them by the Dallas Way. I also looked at Google Maps from more of a modern look. I used in particular Google Street View to sort of, I was really interested, right, in comparing addresses of what used to be, local bars, local restaurants that were, really community centers for queer people. I was interested in looking at what those addresses look like now. And, a lot of the time they ended up being converted to things like strip malls or, restaurants that are not queer oriented. But there were a few cases where these bars were still running, or they were running under different names, but they were still run by the same people, still queer organizations. So that was interesting. And then finally, I looked a lot at community media. So places like the Dallas Voice, which is Dallas's LGBTQ newspaper that reports on queer issues in Dallas, and also more broadly in Texas. And I also looked at some information by local historians who had information about what specific addresses look like, and who used to run different bars, different places. And then, when it came time to share my project, I found that there was another question that was brought up, which made sense in the humanities context of it, which is, when is the project finished? Am I done with this project? Am I quote unquote finished with it? And as I thought about it, because I thought on one hand, I think that this project should be quote unquote finished before I share it, right? On the other hand, I didn't want to gloss over my own sort of positionality in this project. I'm not a trained historian. At the time that I made this map, I had lived in Dallas for a year, which is really not enough time to fully understand a place. And, when that's the question, right? How long does it take to really fully understand a place, a location, a geography? Can that ever realistically be achieved? I mean, certainly not in a year. So I really wanted to, when I released this, I didn't want to pretend that I knew everything. I didn't want to pretend that I had created this comprehensive guide to queer history in Dallas, because that was not at all what I did. It was not something I was capable of doing at the time. It would have required a lot more resources. And so I kind of thought about what I meant when I said that a project was finished. And I think what I meant was that it's sort of polished, it's ready to go, it's okay for public consumption, it's been checked, etc. And so what I ultimately decided to do was to share it with the caveat that I was really open to additions or people from the community who had been alive during that time, which a lot of people in Dallas lived through protests that I read about. They went to bars that no longer exist. If anyone had any information that they wanted to share with me, and that they wanted this to be posted, I would be willing to post it. And I did receive a few messages from people who had things that they wanted to add, things about, chain of custody of certain restaurants. And these are things I would not have known, right? So that really made the project better, and it helped me to just also understand a lot more about the place that I called home. I shared the project a few different ways. I shared it with the Dallas Voice, who I mentioned before, was the queer newspaper in Dallas, is the queer newspaper in Dallas. I shared it with my academic/social networks on Twitter. And I also shared it through my institution by writing about it and talking about it and advertising it there. So all of this, right, brings us to a couple of different considerations when it comes to humanities data and humanities GIS. And I think the two main questions, you'll have more specific questions, but the two main ones that you'll be thinking about that come up in humanities GIS, those questions are, first off, how do you record and organize your data? And second, how do you visualize it? Because when it comes to humanities data, right, you're working with things that might be photographs, personal archives, letters, text documents, posters, a ton of different kinds of media. So you'll be coming across data that's likely not binary in texture. One person who writes a lot about this is Miriam Posner, who is a professor at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies. And, she's talked before about how one of the reasons why humanists might be kind of reluctant to describe their work as data is because the quote unquote data that you work with in humanities, the documents, the quote unquote evidence, it's very nuanced and it's not binary. For example, if you're watching a movie, right, there are many different moving parts to that. I think Dr. Posner used this example of like watching a film, and there's a lot going on. There's the plot, there's the characters, there's the actors, the direction, the cinematography, the lighting, the set design, all of this. And it's all happening at once, and it's something that you're really consuming all at once with the faculties of your brain. And it's not something that's easily translatable to something that a lot of people might call data. So that's one thing to think about, right? Is that you'll be coming across this information that you want to include in your project, but it might not be readily available in the format that you want it to be. So it kind of forces you, right, to make decisions about how you're going to represent your data in your spreadsheet, for example. What kinds of information are you going to include? How are you going to include them? How specific are you going to be? How are you going to represent this? And how are you going to code it? These are all questions that are very discipline specific, right? They should be answered with careful attention paid to your disciplinary norms, as well as to the materials that you're looking to make machine readable. So it's very important, right, to be respectful of your materials, be respectful of the community if you're working with a community. And just, you don't want to make your evidence, your quote unquote information, your data, you don't want to shrink that to make it machine readable. You really want to find the best way to have the machine understand what you're saying. So that's my take on that. And, when it comes down to it, right, I think, visualizing the data is a lot of fun, but organizing it is sort of the more important part, because organizing it will determine how you can visualize it. It'll determine what you can do with it. So you really need to spend, you'll probably spend a lot of time organizing your data, cleaning your data, making it machine readable, but it'll pay off because you'll be able to have so much more flexibility with how you visualize it. So some considerations that you'll run into, things like historical addresses. So for example, you might be working with an address that no longer exists, not just like a building that doesn't exist, but an address that you can't really map because it's not recognized as an address by your program. So that's something to consider, how are you going to locate that on your map? What coordinates do you give? Do you give coordinates? When you're representing space, how are you representing the space? How are you representing your subject matter when you make that decision? And then that can lead into another question, right? Which is, how do I visualize my data? Do I use points? Do I use polygons? Do I use both? How do I determine when I use which? And I think, right, points bring precision to a project. They bring precision to your map. But also, if there are concerns about privacy, or even if the location itself is not exact or it's a bit muddled, you don't really quite know where it is. A polygon can cover a broad area that allows for this kind of gentle ambiguity. And this kind of ambiguity might even be preferred when it comes to humanities GIS. I think, right, in traditional GIS, I think that we tend to prefer specificity and precision and knowing exactly which points we're referring to and what those points are doing. But I don't think that a bit of ambiguity is necessarily a bad thing. I think that, having this sort of, I don't want to call it fuzzy, but just a little bit of ambiguous space can itself be an interesting way of negotiating your material and negotiating your material's connection to geography. And then also, right, it's going to come down to your choice of visualization tool. So, how are you visualizing your data? What kinds of programs are you using to visualize it? Because there's a lot of different ones, right? There are some that are more oriented to the humanities. There are some that are less. There are some that have a really friendly GUI, GUI, I call it a GUI. And then there's some that are very, command line oriented. So it all comes down to your personal taste, your comfort level, your experience level, all of that. And so finally, I want to note that, I talked about this a bit during your presentation, but digital humanities, I see this being a very two-way street, right? I think that digital humanities might be thought of as using computers to generate information or discover information about, like a text, for example. But I think that there's a lot of ways that the humanities can also inform the digital part of it, right? So, asking not only, what kinds of data can I extract from this text document? What kinds of data can I extract from this letter? But also asking, sort of like, how does my tool work? How is my tool enhancing the meaning? How is my tool enhancing the meaning of what I'm working with? How is it engaging with the meaning or the medium that I'm working with? Basically, how does the tool that I chose, is it enhancing my project? Is it detracting from it? And what does it say, on a philosophical level about my project, about my discipline, about my source material? So it's very much a two-way street. And that is it. I have the link up on the screen to my project again, and it's going to also be in the description box for this video. I have my contact information up there as well, in case you want to get in touch and talk a bit more about this or related things. And it was really great to be here and to talk, and I am looking forward to the rest of it. So have a great rest of your GIS day, and I will see you around maybe.